Hello, my name is Callison Ames, and I will be presenting to you on the artist track that I chose to do for my final project in HA 367, Art and Culture of Japan. So for my first pre-1600 work, I chose to do a Haniwa figure, in particular Haniwa horse. So this figure was from the Kofun period, which dated from 300 to 710 of the Common Era. And so a little bit of history on these Haniwa. They were terracotta figures, so that's a clay sourced from the ground. And the legs on the figures are so long because they were partially placed in the ground in areas surrounding tombs. So their purpose was thought to protect the dead, and then also serve as a boundary between the realms of real life and then afterlife, and then provide the deceased with like a familiar atmosphere, and then in this case specifically also provide the deceased with a horse to ride in the afterlife. So next we'll talk about the process of making these. There was a couple of times where I had to stray away from the traditional process. So I'll also kind of talk about those. But the primary process for this was coil building. So the artist would have sourced the clay from the ground, the terracotta from the ground, but conveniently enough, I used box clay from Chalmers. And then they would have wedged the clay until it was workable enough to start rolling coils. And that is also what I did. So you roll coils and then you do something called scoring and slipping. So scoring, the artist would have used a sharp tool to kind of like make scratch marks on the coils. And then slip is a watered down clay. It's almost like a frosting consistency. And then they put that over the score marks and then place another coil on top of that. And that just adds to the stability and make sure that the coils stay together. So the artist would have done that by placing one coil in a circular formation and then scoring, slipping another coil to it, and then would have continued on that process until they reached a desired height for one of the legs, and they would have repeated that 4 times for each of the 4 legs. And then they would have, you can see it in the bottom right corner here, a bigger cylinder, and that would act as the body. So in the next slide here, so starting from the left, you can kind of see the body there. And then, so after sculpting the body and fastening the body to the legs, then you would have started with the neck. And those were also coils that were kind of cut into a different shape. And then after building the neck in sorts, you would have attached the head, and you can kind of see how the entire figure is smoothed out. So that was done by I used a serrated rib, and they would have used kind of a similar, something with like teeth of sorts to, and brush that along the whole figure. And that smooths out the coils, so you can't see the coil lines except within the figure. And then you would have smoothed it over with like a wooden tool. And then next, after kind of making the structure there, we have this. So we have the head, and we just kind of like a crude figure of a horse. And then you would have added they would have added ornamentation by means of sculpting, and then also things to give it more personality, more features that actually look like a horse. So here it is in the next slide. So this is my final product. So we cut out eyes and then cut out ear holes and then added the ears, which were also coils. And then ornamentation. This isn't from one specific Haniwa. It isn't modeled after one specific Haniwa horse, but kind of an amalgamation of different ones that I studied in books and of that sort. So that is my first work from the artist track. And next I chose for my post 1600 work was a Zen ink painting from the Edo period, which dates from 1603 to 1868 in the Common Era. And this specific work is by Hakuin, titled Blind Men Crossing a Bridge. So Hakuin he taught Zen most of his life. He didn't get into painting until probably later on in his life, because he saw painting as a distraction from teaching people the true meaning of Zen. So I owe a lot of thank you to Jacinta Johnson from the Spencer Research Library, because I met with her to kind of figure out paper. I know she came and presented to our class and talked about paper, and it was actually really interesting because we kind of did like a deep dive into looking into a ton of different papers, and we came to an informed decision that this was most likely done Japanese washi paper made from kozo. And kozo fibers are the longest and strongest of the fibers. And so it's kozo paper, sumi ink, and then Hakuin would also use sumi ink, and then a brush made from animal hair, and they're normally either horse, goat, or weasel. So talking about this process here, there was also a couple times where I had to stray from Hakuin's traditional process, although I did use the kozo paper that was, we can kind of tell, this isn't a great photo of it because I took this photo from a book, but you can kind of see the laid and chain lines, which is made in the traditional process of Japanese paper making that we saw videos of in class. But so we used that paper that Hakuin would have used, and then sumi ink. So I used sumi ink. You can kind of see it there in the top left corner. It's already liquid, but Hakuin would have used a stick of sumi ink. And sumi ink is a combination of soot, animal glue, and then camphor, which is for fragrance. And then when you use a stick, you kind of grind the stick along something called an inkstone and then mix with water. But once again, I use the liquid. So then in the process of making this, it went by actually really quickly. But there's another photo. So I don't have a ton of progression photos because you can't really, and I kind of realized this while I was doing it. You don't have a lot of time to kind of like sit there and think about the brush strokes, where they have to be pretty rapid. And that was also kind of a study within Zen, is kind of like letting go and letting the ink work, if that makes sense. And here's another up close detail shot. So that is my attempt at Japanese calligraphy. But what it actually says in the painting of Hakuin's is, both inner life and the floating world outside us are like the blind men's round log bridge. A mind that can cross over is the best guide. So I'm not completely sure if I nailed it on that one. But you can see kind of where in different areas on the paper, the ink is a little like lighter, and as opposed to where there's darker strokes, that just kind of depended on how much ink I loaded the brush with. And then in other parts, you can kind of see at the top right that large gray, I guess it would be a rock of sorts. I diluted the brush with water to kind of get um, that more, I guess, like airy feel to it. And it almost like has a wetness to it, as opposed to the actual men when they're on the bridge. They have a pretty crisp texture to them. And then finally, I chose to, Hakuin would have put his seal on there in a red pigment, but that's kind of like his signature. So that is a place where I also strayed away from the process. But other than that, there once again is the final product in the bottom right corner, and you can kind of see it's more apparent the laid lines and the chain lines there, and it is a very thin paper. You can kind of see my desk from the other side of it. But thank you.